In the not-so-distant future, the world is ravaged by a devastating virus. Infected humans develop red rashes on their abdomens, and as the condition worsens, they experience nausea, mental confusion, and aggressive behavior. Humanity has already fallen, and in this post-apocalyptic world, the desolate, uninhabited forest is undoubtedly an excellent refuge for survivors. Annie, who lives alone, has made her home here. By post-apocalyptic standards, her camp is above average-ish, has a car, guns, and tools. Although Annie appears delicate, she possesses ample wilderness survival skills. She keeps the camp meticulously organized, but at night and on rainy days, she can't help but think of her husband and daughter. On the night when the government completely lost control, Annie's family hurriedly packed up their house. Her husband wanted to take the family to the forest where he had lived as a child. At first, as they hid from the infected, things went well. They had plenty of food and ammunition, a dependable husband, and a daughter as angelic as ever. So even in the apocalypse, Annie didn't find life unbearably hard. To help Annie become self-reliant, her husband constantly taught her all kinds of wilderness survival skills and hunting techniques. But in such a desperate environment, a warm and happy life is like poison wrapped in honey eventually. The cruel edge of reality will show itself. The food for the three of them quickly ran out, just as Annie now pulls herself out of her memories. Annie has only a few crackers left, along with some disgusting worms. After the virus, almost all animals have gone extinct, and the traps have yielded nothing for a long time. In order to fill her stomach, she had no choice but to prepare to head to the residential area in search of food. But before that, there were some necessary preparations to make. Annie took out a sharp blade and, gritting her teeth, cut open her own arm. She collected the blood, which gave off a strong fishy smell, in a bottle. She smeared filth on her body to mask her scent, grabbed her gun with only 4 bullets left, and mustered the courage to leave the safety of her camp. When she reached the barbed wire, blocking her way, Annie smeared blood on a broken toy. She did this to attract the monster's attention. As soon as the mechanical sound rang out, a chilling roar echoed from afar. Annie knew her plan had worked, and she quickly ran to the other side of the residential area, slipping through a gap in the iron fence to reach her destination. Fortunately, there were many mistakes in the houses this time, which delighted Annie, and she quickly swept everything clean. But just as she was leaving, she accidentally kicked over the iron bucket she had used as a step. The crisp sound instantly spread out, and Annie was shocked and terrified. She fled toward the wire fence like a madwoman, the terrifying figure already appearing behind her. Annie managed to squeeze through the gap just in time, but in her panic, her abdomen was slashed by the wire, and blood gushed out instantly. But at the brink of life and death, Annie couldn't worry about that. She forced herself to endure the pain and left quickly. However, as the blood kept flowing, her body grew weaker and weaker, and in the end, she collapsed to the ground from exhaustion. Her food was scattered all over the ground, but Annie was still gripped by fear. She didn't have time to pick it up and struggled to keep running. At last, she fled back to the camp, still shaken. If she hadn't been utterly desperate, she would never have gone to the pond where the residents washed away their filth. Based on her husband's experience, monsters were sensitive to blood. To avoid exposure, Annie gritted her teeth, stitching the wound on her abdomen despite excruciating pain. The next day, Annie equipped herself and went to retrieve food. Without fresh blood, the infected were nowhere to be seen, and she completed her task smoothly. She hurried her steps, wanting to get back to the camp as soon as possible, but on the way she unexpectedly came across the father and daughter. The man had fainted by the roadside from excessive blood loss, while the little girl was helplessly sobbing in a low voice. Annie couldn't bear to ignore them, but in this situation, she also didn't dare to act rashly. She could only raise her gun and watch the two of them warily, asking if they had been infected. Upon hearing this, the girl hurriedly lifted her father's shirt to show that she had no rash on her body. This made Annie feel a bit more at ease. After confirming that they were not infected, she brought them back to the camp. Through conversation, Annie learned that the girl's name was Li Wei, and the unconscious man was actually her stepfather, Chris. They came from the south and were heading north, where it was said that the situation was already under control. Annie didn't ask for more details, as they awkwardly explained that once Chris got better, they would leave and wouldn't impose on Annie for long. Annie understood and arranged their accommodation. Levi and Chris slept in the tent, while she stayed in the car. At night, when everything was silent, Annie sat alone, fiddling with the only 4 bullets she had left, as if reminiscing about the time she spent with her husband. During the days when Chris was unconscious, Annie and Levi acted together. They were like a mother and daughter. Annie taught Levi the skills she had learned and also took the initiative to share whatever work she could handle. As night fell and they returned to camp, they were surprised to find that the man had already woken up. Levi threw herself excitedly into Chris's arms, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. After a brief moment of excitement, the three of them sat around the warm campfire. Since he had just woken from a long sleep, Chris praised Annie's camp for having a tent, food, and a cart. How many people dream of having all this? Hearing this, Annie couldn't help but become more alert. In the wilderness, you can never truly know people's hearts. She didn't want the story of the farmer and the snake to repeat itself with her. When Chris asked if the car's gas tank was full, Annie immediately denied it. Chris realised Annie was being cautious. After thanking her for her help, he said that they would continue heading north the next day. Unexpectedly, it poured rain the following day. Annie looked out the window from inside the car and saw Chris and Levi cleaning up traces of their stay in the wind and rain. This scene softened Annie's heart, and she decided to let them get in the car after all. The two of them sat closer to the front seats. To break the awkward silence, Chris started chatting with Annie. This was the first time Annie had shared her story of coming here with anyone else. When Levi asked if it was her husband who had turned her into a terminal expert, Annie couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with sadness and hurriedly got out of the car before her tears could fall. Chris stopped Levi from asking any more questions, understanding Annie's pain. Soon, Annie returned to the car with some food, pretending as if nothing had happened. As the three of them continued to talk, their relationship gradually grew closer. Levi, accompanied by Hanyu, closed her eyes as Chris began to share his own story. His ex-wife had been infected by the virus, and Chris couldn't bear to abandon her, so he had no choice but to chain her to the bed, yet he was powerless to help. His ex-wife screamed endlessly from the bed, and after enduring unbearable torment, Chris finally chose to end her life with his own hands. Chris trembled continuously as he spoke, as if those terrifying memories were replaying over and over in his mind. Annie had once been a nurse, and she had cared for infected patients at the time. After hearing Chris's story, she couldn't help but recall her own sense of helplessness back then, and tears instantly welled up in her eyes. A sense of sadness lingered inside the car. In the morning, Chris and Livy played by the pond, and the gloom from the previous day had completely vanished from their faces. Annie, however, couldn't understand how, after experiencing such a heavy blow, Livy could act as if she had forgotten everything. While fishing, Chris kept talking about funny stories with his friends from before the apocalypse, which made Annie increasingly irritated. She interrupted Chris, who wouldn't stop chattering. As night fell, Annie finally couldn't hold back, and honestly expressed her confusion. She simply couldn't forget those painful memories. Chris looked at Annie, who was lost in her grief, and said that she hadn't forgotten either, she just chose to recall the good memory. Chris's words were like a stone thrown into a pond, stirring ripples in Annie's heart. Another day passed, and Annie watched Chris sleeping soundly beside her in the tent. In the chaos and upheaval of the apocalypse, it seemed that Levi was beginning to develop some feelings for Chris. Levi asked Chris when they would set out again, wanting to spend more time alone with her. Chris replied that it would be soon, but her words unconsciously revealed her concern for Annie. This made Levi a bit dissatisfied. While working with Annie, he was distracted and accidentally cut his finger, blood streaming out. Annie didn't scold him. Instead, she tenderly bandaged his finger. The cartoon character on the band-aid was from a show Levi used to love. This reminded Annie of her daughter again. At noon, the three of them each munched on some biscuits. Chris carefully set one aside to save as food for the road. The observant Annie noticed Chris's actions and realised they were about to set off, so she offered to give him some extra food. Chris, understanding how hard it was for Annie to come by food, shook his head and declined. Instead, he warmly invited her to join them. Annie politely refused. She did not want to leave this forest full of memories. Perhaps, influenced by Chris, Annie no longer furrowed her brows. At the river where they last went fishing, Chris made a bet with the two of them, wagering whether he could hit a distant small hole with a stone. Annie looked at the mischievous Chris and agreed with a helpless smile, and Levi agreed as well. In the end, Chris's bets were an unlimited dinner from Annie and making Levi do her least favourite activity, swimming. Levi hated swimming in the bottomless lake. Chris successfully made the shot, so they all went swimming in the pond together. Levi watched as the atmosphere between Annie and Chris grew more and more ambiguous, and no one seemed to care about her feelings, which made her burn with anger. But the two of them remained immersed in that mood. At dinner, Chris's attention was entirely on Annie, almost forgetting Levi's existence, and Levi's expression was clouded with gloom. The next day, Levi tried to probe Chris's feelings, only to helplessly discover that Chris had already fallen in love with Annie. Levi looked at Annie in the distance and suddenly found her figure glaringly conspicuous, because when she was with Annie, she asked for Annie's wedding ring out of curiosity, put it on, and asked Annie how her husband had proposed. Annie smiled as she recounted memories from the past. When Levi heard that the ring was second-hand, she couldn't help but boast about how wealthy Chris used to be, and then mercilessly mocked Annie. Annie wasn't bothered by Levi's offensive words, because she was reminded of a night with her husband. Their daughter suddenly developed a fever, and the baby in swaddling clothes was in critical condition, urgently needing medication. Annie and her husband were anxious and distraught. The dark forest was full of dangers, but her husband refused to leave things to fate. Annie smeared mud on herself, kissed him goodbye, and hurriedly disappeared into the night. The long night devoured time. Anxious and desperate, Annie heard a heart-wrenching howl. After several gunshots, the silent night was left with nothing but the sound of her daughter's crying. No other disturbance remained. The next day, Annie found her husband dead on the lawn. There was food in her backpack, and in his hand he was still tightly clutching the bottle of medicine. Annie did not cry. She numbly picked up the food and medicine. More than sadness, she needed to become strong. Annie understood that from now on she would have to take care of her daughter alone. She could no longer be a fragile wife. She covered the car with fallen leaves and mud, then comforted her daughter inside the vehicle. Fully armed and anxious, Annie set out. Her light footsteps went unnoticed by the other monsters, and she made it into the house without incident. Annie was on high alert. As soon as she reached the kitchen, she immediately raised her gun. An infected person was facing away from Annie, devouring food noisily, completely unaware of Annie's presence. Seeing this, Annie silently took aim and, with speed and precision, killed it with a single shot. With her bag full of food, Annie jogged back to the car, where her swaddled daughter was wailing loudly. Annie picked up her daughter to comfort her, feeling a pang of heartache, but she didn't notice the blood from the infected person splattered on her own collar. When Annie put her daughter down, she was shocked to see a smear of blood at the corner of the baby's mouth, her mind going completely blank. Annie couldn't believe she had been so careless. All she could do was pray that fate would not be so cruel. But when her daughter showed symptoms of infection, Annie knew there was no turning back. In despair, she cut her wrist and fed her blood, mixed with an overdose of cold medicine, to her daughter. Annie's heart was in agony, repeating, "I'm sorry." In the end, her daughter passed away in her arms. In her efforts to protect their son, Annie had, through a moment of negligence, failed to protect their daughter. As evening approached, she found a tube of hand cream in the car, brought it back to the tent, and carefully applied it all over her body. Meanwhile, Annie and Chris were checking the route back, with Chris teasing Annie for being so stubborn. Annie, however, smiled and told Chris that she often made herself forget why she was here. At this moment, their feelings for each other were already clear. Back at the campsite, she anxiously waited for Chris to come into the tent. But Chris chose to stay with Annie and Livy. Hearing a sound that broke her heart, she got dressed, took the leftover blood and food that Annie had left in the trunk, and quietly slipped away into the night. Annie and Chris woke up and couldn't help but hope she had stayed. However, Chris brought up Annie's deceased husband and daughter. This instantly angered Annie. She got out of the car in a huff, only to discover that the things in the trunk had been taken. At that moment, Li Wei, who was wandering outside, ran into an infected person. A piercing scream shattered the silence. Chris, desperate to protect his daughter, sprinted over. Anxious, Annie grabbed a gun and rushed after him, only to realize when she tried to shoot that she hadn't brought any bullets. Seeing Chris struggling with the infected, Annie could only use the gun to smash at the infected, creating a brief opening for her. Chris seized the opportunity to stand up, took the weapon, and finished off the infected with the butt of the gun. Seeing the infected splatter a lot of blood, Annie hurriedly asked the two if they knew how terrified she was of her daughter's tragedy happening again. After hearing their reassurances, she finally relaxed. However, today's events left Annie puzzled. Infected people were usually found in residential areas, so how did one appear here? She had no idea that it was actually Li Wei who had secretly lured the infected with blood and food. All just to make Chris leave as soon as possible. The camp was no longer safe, so Chris once again invited Annie to join them. Annie silently refused. She still couldn't forget her guilty past. And how could she dare to pursue happiness? Seeing this, Chris angrily decided to leave the next day. He was frustrated that Annie kept trapping herself in guilt, punishing herself with such behaviour. They both had painful memories, but they needed to learn to face their regrets and step out of the shadows. Chris's words made Annie fall into deep thought. He felt immense guilt over his daughter's death, but perhaps it was time to look forward, carrying these wounds with him. Annie returned to the camp and suggested that they collect enough food in the residential area tomorrow before setting out. This made Chris very pleased, and he immediately agreed to help. Levi also offered to lend a hand, but what the two of them didn't know was that an evil plan was already taking shape in Levi's mind. Before setting out, Chris covered himself in blood to act as bait. Annie and Levi swept through the residential area, while Chris kept dodging the infected to buy them time. They quickly finished collecting supplies. However, just as Annie was about to return, she was suddenly attacked by Levi, who, burning with jealousy, tied her to the side of a cabinet and screamed to attract the infected. He then ran toward the fence to meet up with Chris, unaware that Annie would soon regain consciousness. She broke free from her restraints and escaped the ordeal by hiding in a foul-smelling refrigerator. Levi ran to the car, where Chris had already washed off the blood mist. Not seeing any sign of Annie, Chris immediately asked Levi what had happened. Levi looked heartbroken and didn't have time to answer. The cries of the infected echoed in their minds once again. Seeing this, Chris turned his grief and anger into strength, fighting desperately against the infected with a small iron rod. Fortunately, at that moment, Annie arrived just in time and ambushed from a distance, taking down one infected with each shot. However, Levi was also attacked by the infected. In the blink of an eye, Annie was left with only her last bullet, and the situation became dire. Memories flashed rapidly through her mind. In the end, Annie's guilt toward her daughter made her choose to help Levi escape the crisis. As Annie and Levi continued down the road in silence, Chris had already fallen on the final battlefield. With their faces covered in mud, Annie and Levi were both deeply scarred within. Annie's silent scream was filled with the deepest despair. She was unable to save her beloved, and could only drive off with Levi toward an unknown future. The film ends here. The Last Journey in the Apocalypse is an American film released in 2016. As a low-budget zombie movie, its limited resources are obvious, but the thoughtful script draws viewers in, with intricately connected details and touching moments that are enough to move the audience. What impressed me most in the film was Annie's motherly love, and the stark contrast created by Levi's primal evil. One is a complex adult with noble morals, while the other, representing an innocent child, is driven by jealousy to become a demon from hell. He indirectly caused the death of Chris, who had always protected him. The ending of the film is also quite controversial. What do you think if you were Annie? At the final moment, would you choose to save Levi or Chris? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section. Alright, that's the end of today's journey. ASO is off to develop new routes for everyone. Don't forget to subscribe and like. See you at our next destination. So,